Welcome to Tips, the Townsend Institute podcast series, a show produced by the Townsend Institute at Concordia University, Irvine. This podcast shares stories of leadership, coaching, and counseling experiences that have shaped the lives and careers of our guests, who then provide tips aimed toward helping listeners grow in both their personal and professional lives. I'm Dr. John Townsend, psychologist, organizational consultant, and author of over 30 books, including the New York Times best-selling Boundaries series. I'm also the founder of the Townsend Institute, and I'm excited to introduce your podcast hosts, Dr. Ashley Andrew and Dr. Gilbert Fugit.
Cooler weather, harvest, football, and pumpkins. Welcome everyone to fall. October is about all of these things and more, including a very important subject pertinent to today's topic and guest, Domestic Violence Awareness Month. On this special episode of the Townsend Institute podcast series, we interview Dr. Shelley Coleman, licensed professional counselor with a specialty in intimate partner violence recovery. In recognition, we are shining a light on this important topic and hopefully providing listeners with strategies for hope and healing.
That's right, Ashley. And while Shelley's work is important year-round, we're especially fortunate to highlight her work and personal experiences on today's episode in recognition of Domestic Violence Awareness Month. October 17th is the National Day of Action, in which we wear purple as a symbol of peace, courage, survival, and honor of this important cause. So without further ado, let's get started. We recognize that this topic may be difficult for some of our listeners. If you or someone you know is suffering from domestic violence or its effects, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 1-800-799-7233.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Townsend Institute podcast series. Here we are interviewing Dr. Shelley Coleman. Welcome, Shelley.
Hello, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, we're excited to have you here today to talk a little bit more about both your professional and personal experiences with domestic violence awareness, which I know a topic that's very near and dear to your heart, especially as you've kind of grown with more degrees and certifications here in the counseling world. Before we talk more about your current specialty, will you share with us a little bit about just your journey into counseling and how you, a West Virginia resident, has come to serve as a core faculty member here at Concordia Irvine?
We probably don't have time, honestly, to talk about all
I love it.
We'll take the brief
Yeah.
journey.
Yeah. I always say I've done everything backwards in my life. So, yeah, and I think that's, really starts with the topic what we're discussing here, right? So I was in an abusive marriage for 10 years when my children were little. They're now grown, they're adults, fabulous, fantastic adults. I just want to put that out there for anyone that might be struggling in a bad situation. God is good, and your kids can be safe and have good futures. So I will say that. And then just kind of to go back to your question though, Ashley, I think, for me personally, and I, again, not going to all the details that landed me in that abusive situation, just suffice it to say, it felt like 10 years were stolen really from my life.
Mm-hmm.
I am grateful for the redemption of Jesus and how he takes really awful things and turns them into good. And I think that, the fact that I am here teaching as a core faculty member at Townsend Institute is a miracle in and of itself because, and I've shared this with Dr. Townsend before, when my girls, who are now 30 and 27, were 6 and 4, I was in a Christian bookstore, and this was before my son came along, and I was in such despair about my situation. I didn't understand what was going on. And I was in the book section, again, trying to find a book that would help me understand what was going on. And I had my girls playing with the VeggieTales toys and looking at books so that I could peruse, and came across this book called Boundaries in Marriage and opened it up and started reading my story.
Mm.
And it didn't go into the depths of what I was hoping in terms of like how to confront abuse, but it highlighted something very different than the typical Christian book, which was just love more, just
Mm.
give, and then they'll come around eventually, right? That
Yeah.
wasn't working for me. And so how crazy, that that's the book that started this journey out of the abuse. And now here I am teaching for,
Wow. Flash forward 25 years, and now here you are.
Mm.
yeah,
Wow. That's beautiful.
Shelley, your story is really one of resiliency in a lot of ways to keep going right now that you're teaching here and you got your PhD. And one thing you're trained in is emotionally focused therapy and somatic experiencing. So I don't know a lot about that. Maybe our listeners don't either. What can you describe what that means and how it can be helpful in the mental health counseling?
sure. Yeah, so I share with students and clients because I still have a private practice where I work with women in these relationships. That I approach counseling from kind of a trans theoretical model. I had the privilege of working for a hospital for about 8 years that invested in me, and I'm so grateful that they did. I was able to be trained in Sue Johnson's model of emotionally focused therapy, which is
Mhm.
very much like has a lot of, I will say, similarities to Dr. Townsend's model in that it's an attachment based model,
Mm.
Mm.
which means we work with clients from the bottom up, like the
Mm.
limbic brain to the prefrontal cortex. We get into the root, right? We're not just trying to intellectually talk and solve problems. Not that any therapy modality necessarily does that, but particularly the attachment-based models really go underneath and try to figure out, okay, what's in the hardwiring here? What happened developmentally, right, that set me on this path of coping and surviving?
Mm.
Um, and what can I do now to begin to shift those neural pathways?
Mm.
Then comes my somatic training, which is a body-informed modality, which very much supports the nervous system structure that has been hardwired throughout my experiences to set me up for my style of relating. And the
Mm.
reason that the intersection of these two theories are so important is because when you're working with someone, say, who's still in an abusive situation, we have to be able to track and provide some insight in terms of what's getting in the way of me being able to take steps to potentially exit the abuse. Now, that's a big question, lots of complexity about it around it. But my doctoral dissertation was really looking at that particular question because from the outside, I think people look and think, well, just leave, right? Like
Mhm.
people tell me that. I had a
Mhm.
psychiatrist say, you
Yeah.
need to take your two little girls, you need to go move in with your parents. And I was just dumbfounded because I
Mm.
thought, I will die if I do that. And,
Mm.
not, and that's again, worst case. I mean, best case scenario, this very mentally ill person who was highly abusive, mentally, psychologically, um, physically in the sense of, owning weapons and terrorism and that sort of thing. I didn't want him having unsupervised custody of my kids, right?
Right,
So
right.
there's all this complexity around that. And I think as counselors, we have to take that into consideration, but we also have to be equipped with theoretical models that help us to resource a client to connect to, their, what we would call in counseling language, their true self, which as a Christian, I would just say is the imago Dei, right? It's what our original creation was meant for. But God also gave us this fantastic survival nervous system that helps us
Mhm.
to mitigate threat. And when we stay in those spaces, neural pathways of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn, it's not
Mhm.
enough to tell somebody, well, just leave, because
Right.
maybe people pleasing and managing that other person's behavior has been the way not only I've survived, but I've kept my kids safe. So we have
Right.
to work with that very specifically. So the intersection, I think, of an attachment model with a somatic focused model has been really informative in that.
And you said something going back to, you were afraid to have your kids, right, with this
Yeah.
person, I don't know, perpetrator, whatever you call it. Do you find a lot that happens in your therapy, that person
Mhm.
holds this power over not only the person, but the kids and things? So, oh yeah, if you do this, I'm going to do that, or I'll even hurt myself, and then it's all your responsibility. I'm doing this. I mean, do you find this manipulation all the time? I would imagine.
100%. I think that is probably one of the things that's not talked about enough. At least
Mhm.
I live in a rural space, Appalachia culture here in West Virginia. And I think for me, again, hopefully we're growing a little bit, but for me, it was like nobody ever talked about that part, right? I
Mhm.
mean, people acknowledged maybe it was financially hard, maybe it was hard to break that attachment. But for me, the biggest factor was keeping my children safe.
Right.
And I think one of the things, I actually think the word perpetrator is very fitting because, even my ex-partner had been harmed himself when he was young. And
Mm.
what we know is that people who are harmed when they're little, not always, of course, lots
Mm.
of survivors that become flourishing, whole, healed individuals, but not everybody, walks that path. And so for him, he was reenacting a
Mhm.
lot of the abuse he had suffered.
Mhm.
And I think, them becoming an adult, had found ways to weaponize his power.
Mm.
And again, coming out of a real kind of sheltered Christian upbringing, I just saw him as a very charismatic individual
Mm.
and, didn't realize, the abuse. It was so covert, right? That it didn't look like abuse
Yeah.
initially,
Right.
particularly again for the community, the culture in which I was raised. So that made it tricky to even identify it.
Yeah. Well, that's a great point. And I guess maybe that leads to my next question is how can we help identify it? I'm thinking about listeners, tuning into this episode right now, and we're in October. It's Domestic Violence Awareness Month. So
Right.
for those who might be questioning, like, am I in an abusive relationship? Or is my neighbor, is my friend, is my sibling? Like, what are some of the key indicators or questions to ask?
I think that's so important for us to begin to name
Hmm.
because, for those who have never been in an abusive relationship, right? It it is so covert. I think one of the things we need to remember too when we have this conversation, and I'll get back to your question, Ashley, but you know, perpetrators or dangerous people are often highly protected. And what I
Mm.
mean by
Mhm.
that is they're not islands to themselves. They often come from family systems
Mhm.
or even religious systems, but
Yes.
some types of systems that protect the perpetration of harm
Mm.
by enabling
Mhm.
or
Normalizing it
exactly
probably. Yep.
normalizing, which was my experience, right?
Mhm.
Where his family, particularly his mother, was in so much denial about his
Mm.
behavior. Why would he have to face his behavior, right? When he has
Mhm.
his mother saying, oh, that's not what that is. Of
Mhm.
all people, who was also abused, right, by his dad, who was
Mhm.
at the time deceased, but just saying that she had not had her own awareness
Got
of her
it.
own experience. And again, that ties in with her survival. And so we can make sense of all that and at the same time name how dangerous that is. But I do want to really name a few things real quickly, Ashley, for listeners. If you're questioning,
Mhm.
trust your gut.
Mhm.
Someone who is weaponizing their position of power or weaponizing scripture to
Mm.
Mm.
maintain, I'll say,
Mm.
abuse or control and power. That's usually one of the telltale signs, right? When a partner is intent on maintaining power and control,
Mhm.
and they use certain ways to do that. You
Yeah.
already mentioned Gilbert manipulation, so it may be, again, threats to take the kids away,
Mhm.
threats, or not even just threats, but following through with, not resourcing a partner with needed finances to
Mhm.
take care of the bills or home. It could be controlling how a person dresses, how they look. I know for me, that was a big part of it. Even if I left the house to go to the grocery store, I was frequently interrogated when I came back to know if I had spoken to any males, cashiers, people that worked in stores. I was grilled for any interactions I may have had with other men. So I think there's a spectrum too, right? Because some
Right.
that can be quite intense, while others may be the same type of behavior, but on a lesser scale. And I think it's important to name it for what it is, because it's easy to downplay it. And so naming this as abusive behavior is really important.
As you've talked about this, it sounds like it runs into generational, right? I mean, there's family dynamics and generational, and it's all, you see it cycle over and over again, and being able to break that that cycle is so critical. And so if you're giving somebody, they're saying, hey, I want to go into counseling. Okay. And we're talking now about domestic violence. I have a feeling every counselor is going to deal with this, right? What would be some tips that you'd want to share with our listeners who maybe that's not their specialization, but they need to be able to work in that world?
Yeah, well, and I think this would be the answer that a lot of us as counselors would say is, get supervision if this is not your wheelhouse and you're not super familiar. I know most communities have advocates, domestic violence advocates, who I've invited into my private practice to speak with my clinicians that work here. Because if it hasn't been your experience, you've got to become educated. There's so many particularities and nuances to this experience. And the last thing that you want to do as a counselor is misattune to someone who's being abused, or
Which it sounds like was something your previous
Yeah.
psychiatrist did with you, right? In saying, just leave, right? Just leave. You need attuning and recognizing that
Right.
it's not just that easy for a lot of people, right?
Right. And I will say, I think being able to hang in there with someone who's still in the abusive situation. I have a couple of women I'm currently still working with, right? They've been in these situations for years and years and years. So leaving something dangerous, it's a process, not an event.
Yes.
And I think if we start to think as counselors that our job is to see this person through to leaving, we're going to miss a lot. We really become the nervous system regulators for folks that are trying to navigate something very complex and very dangerous. And so there's a lot of ethical considerations, but I think the main thing is going to be to educate yourself in that particular area. Just like any issue that a person may be coming into counseling with, if you are someone who is new to the field, there's no shame in going to your supervisor and saying, I feel really unprepared for this. I mean, I have again, some of my counselors who have said that to me before, and supervisees, right? And so we sit down and we have conversations about it. I would much rather work with someone that can say, I need support here, than to just kind of pretend they know how to handle something when they really don't.
Yeah. That's great advice. I think that's important for really actually probably any, emphasis or area of specialty that you have. I mean, we're talking about domestic violence support, but really in any areas, being open to what you need and finding those who can help resource you. Wow.
Yeah.
That's wonderful. Well, another question we want to talk about a little bit more about your faith integration into this field. And we, of course, know you as a strong Christian who deeply relies on your faith. How does that play into your counseling? Even as you talked about, sometimes there's difficult situations where religion has been used poorly or against the individual. How do you navigate that?
Yeah. Well, as a counselor, I think we have to hold, again, our ACA Code of Ethics is not to impose our own values onto a client. I happen to live, again, in an area that is largely Christian. So, that is an experience people are bringing in, and it's so different, right, for different people. Some people are very disconnected and distanced from God because they feel abandoned by God. And I have to say, in my own experience, there was many, many times I felt that way too. I try to, draw on my experience without projecting that onto my clients, of course, because again, everyone's going to have their unique journey. I can say for me, my faith was what helped me survive. It was very central. I felt I was so isolated. And I think this is another thing to remember, that oftentimes abusers, perpetrators will isolate victims so that they don't have access to church or friends or community or family even.
Mm.
And if they do have access, it's usually controlled by the abusive person. So you go to church where they want to go to church, where they're going to hear what they want to hear, right?
Mm.
Scriptures being cherry picked to reinforce their controlling behavior.
Mhm.
So I think it's really important, maybe as someone who's experienced abuse,
Mhm.
to get some space between this person who is trying to control me
Mhm.
and what my relationship with Jesus looks like.
Right.
And I think, fortunately, I was able to do that. And I attribute that largely to my Christian upbringing,
Mhm.
that was not tangled up with this type of abuse,
Mm.
that gave me a sense of Jesus as my safe person, right? So that was a resource. But I think as counselors, we have to be mindful that that might not be everybody's experience. And
Yeah.
I could say, just as much as I had goodness from my faith community, there was also harm that
Mhm.
that set me up because I always say nothing's all good or all bad, right? So
No.
even though growing up I had, the gift of experience Jesus as safe, there was also a culture of hierarchy, in the sense where, I was sort of trained to believe that I submit to my husband without questioning. And I would
Mm.
say, like, that works maybe okay for some people if you have like a
Mhm.
super loving husband.
Yeah.
But, as a counselor, I'm going to say it really doesn't work either, because that's not biblical. But but just putting that out there to say, particularly like for women who are in abusive relationships, if you are in a religious system that tends to be heavy on the scriptures around submission,
Mhm.
that is going to be another layer of complexity.
Mm.
And again, as counselors, it's our job to contain that and
Yes.
help clients differentiate and figure out, what do they believe, and how is that maybe impacting their current struggle, in ways that get in the way of other good things that God has intended for them.
Shelley, I mean, today I really appreciate the vulnerability you have shared with this in your own life, and talking about how you're working with others. And that, I mean, that really speaks to how we model this in a lot of ways and want this with our students and as we go out there. But as we end all of our episodes here, what do you think a takeaway tip would be for our listeners to walk away with?
Mm. Yeah, I think because we've been talking so much about, how counselors work
Mhm.
with clients who are either in these relationships or have maybe gotten out and are trying to pursue healing. The tip for counseling professionals is, again, what we've already stated is, to stay educated and to stay really particularly connected to your client's story. But I think I would want to maybe enlarge that, because there's a lot of people listening that aren't necessarily counselors, right? But
Right.
maybe
Yes.
concerned loved ones.
Mhm.
And I want to just validate how difficult it is, right? I know it was so hard for my family to watch me those years and watch their
Mhm.
grandchildren, their nieces, nephew, right? So to watch someone you love in an abusive situation, to feel helpless, again, get support for yourself
Mm.
first.
yeah.
Because I think, that's what happens a lot of times. We hear, people saying, my child needs help, my daughter, my son, because they're seeing the suffering happening. But if you're not doing your own internal work, you're not going to have the capacity to show up for the person that you're seeing suffer, right? It's kind of like that old adage of being on an airplane and you have to put the oxygen mask on yourself
Mm-hmm.
if you're going to be any good to help the person next to
Yeah,
you, even
right.
if they're a vulnerable child. And in this case, the person experiencing abuse is vulnerable, but if you're not getting some care and support for yourself, you will not have the capacity, the resources to help them in the particular ways they need help. So I think that would be my tip, would be get your own care for your own body.
You mentioned daughter or son.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to also clarify that men are
Yes.
victims of domestic violence as well.
Yeah.
You maybe even have a statistic on that, while it is not as much as females, which
Yeah.
is why so many more times we refer to like the wife or the
Right.
girlfriend. But I think it is important to also recognize that
Yeah.
men very well can be victimized. And then we didn't even talk about, same-sex relationships that
Right.
may
Right.
as well.
I so appreciate, Ashley, you naming that. And my colleague, Dr. Pfeiffer, and I do a lot of presentations on this topic.
Mhm.
And we do have slides on the statistics, and particularly because they are such overlooked vulnerable groups in terms of, well, I'll specify, and I'll speak to this really briefly. So yes, I think it's important that we understand the same thing can happen with men in our culture,
Mhm.
where women also are the perpetrators
Right.
by using tactics of power and control and manipulation
Mhm.
to control their partner.
Yeah.
They can also be perpetrators of violence. They
Yeah.
can be people that hit and slap and punch.
Mhm.
And, even though that's not a part of everybody's story, and I want to make that clear too, that domestic
Right.
violence doesn't always involve that.
Right.
It can, but physical abuse can also be owning a weapon that is used to threaten. That was my
Mhm.
story, right? So the
Right.
weapon was used to threaten me. That's called intimidation. It's actually in the West Virginia Code of Domestic Violence as a form of physical abuse is intimidation. A lot of people don't know that. And
Interesting.
so,
Hmm.
the other piece that you just lifted up as counselors, especially, and love and family members, when we have loved ones in the LGBTQ community, or we have folks seeking counseling from those communities, so important to recognize the extra layer of vulnerability that comes with, the vulnerability of being part of that population, first of all. So
Mhm.
that's already a barrier. Then making their way, finding care, and then maybe saying, my partner's abusing me, and there's these social biases, right, around
Mhm.
these types of dynamics. So I think it's really important that, again, we go back to the idea of Imago Dei. We are all
Mhm.
created in the image of God.
Yes.
And when we can hold that for our family members, our counselees, and recognize that, I have an image bearer here that is
Mhm.
in trouble, that is being harmed. What is my role? It's the same thing, whether they
Same.
are male, female, or identify as something else. I want to be able to provide care in a way that is ethical and holistic and evidence-based, right? So as a
Yes.
counselor, that my approach is the same. As a loved one and a family member, hopefully, right, I can also, again, go to my the thing that, I've always said too, is to get care for yourself
Mhm.
so that you can also provide care for your loved one, whether they're male, female, or identify in a different type of relationship. So
Yes.
such a great question. I'm glad you asked that, Ashley.
No, that was so great. I mean, you just highlighted again the complexities
Yes.
that are involved. And there's
Yeah.
obviously far more than we would ever be able to cover in a brief podcast episode. But you've just, again, shared so much with our listeners and with us today to shed light, as we will all of October, on this really important cause. So thank you, Shelley. We can't thank you enough. We appreciate it. And thanks for sharing with our listeners.
Thank you, Shelley.
Of course. It's great to be with you guys.
If you enjoy the Townsend Institute podcast series, head to our website at cui.edu/Townsend to find out more about the certificates, bachelor's, master's, and doctoral degrees offered through Concordia University, Irvine. With programs in mental health counseling, executive coaching and consulting, and organizational leadership, we have a variety of faith-based programs dedicated to helping you fulfill your academic and professional goals, all the while furthering your competence, character, and connection. Again, that's cui.edu/Townsend.